This program is sponsored by Safe Life Experience Consult Limited. Contact them for all your travel and tour needs, as well as your events.
Eamonn O'Brien is my name. I'm from the southwest of Ireland, and I joined the Missionary Society of St. Columban in 1962. The Missionary Society of St. Columban was established to go to mission in China. But when I was in the seminary until 1969, nobody could go to China because China was closed down because of the situation there. So, however, in 1979, I had an opportunity to visit China, and I visited Beijing in 1979 and had my first touch with China. And then all the stories I'd heard about the Colomban missionaries, more than 100 who had worked in Hanyang Diocese, came back alive for me. I was in Beijing, and it was an extraordinary experience. China was opening up at that time, and things were changing. Mao Zedong had died, Deng Xiaoping had come in, and he was beginning to open up China. And I had my first experience in China when things were opening up. The churches were opening, the temples were opening, the monasteries were opening, and I was able to visit all of them. And I talked to many people there that time. It was extraordinary. Well, the Catholic Church in China has a very long history. Most people think of the beginning of the Catholic Church was in the Tang Dynasty. However, there's a theory going around today that the Catholic Church in China began in the 2nd century, but it's not substantiated with scholarship. So the first beginnings of the Catholic Church was in the Tang Dynasty, what we Catholics in the West called Nestorian Christianity, but what the Chinese called a beautiful, delightful message. So there was a different understanding of Christianity. Then, of course, in the 12th century, there was a bishop appointed in Beijing. Things collapsed at the end of the Tang Dynasty, and there was a bishop appointed in Beijing, but that also faded out. So the beginnings of modern-day Catholic Church in China was with Matteo Ricci in the 16th century. And he then left an indelible mark on China from a Catholic Church point of view. Well, yes, before I go to the underground church, can I talk a little bit? From the 17th century on, when Matteo Ricci started there, many missionaries came to China from the Western world. And during the periods there were times when the emperor closed down the Catholic Church and expelled the missionaries. So it wasn't universally okay. But then going into the modern day China, when the communists took over in 1949, there was a huge change. And then in 1957, the Catholic Church met, and I know people who were at that meeting. They prayed, they studied, they researched, and they discussed how can the Catholic Church work with this communist government. Now, at that time, you have to remember that the Catholic Church in the West was very anti-communist. I remember when I went to the seminary first in 1962, my first talk was anti-communist because that was the talk of Pius XII. So there was a very big anti-communist situation. So the Catholics met, seminarians, priests and sisters met in 1957, and after praying and thinking and reflecting, they divided. They divided because some decided they would work with the government and some decided they would not work with the government. So a split took place in the Catholic Church, and that's the basis for what we call the underground church and the overground church. But I don't use that language anymore. The language I prefer to use is the registered church and the unregistered church. The registered church decided to register as part of, as everybody does in China. The unregistered church decided not to register and not to work with the government. And that led to a split. Now, many people say that the unregistered church was loyal to the Pope and the registered church was loyal to the government. That is totally false. Also, many people say that the unregistered church suffered more and the registered church escaped because they were loyal to the government. That is also totally false. The truth is that the registered church were open and public, and they could have been taken easily. Many of them suffered many things because they were registered. Yes, of course, the unregistered church as well suffered many things because they were unregistered, and they were technically called illegal, and therefore when they met with their communities, it was an illegal gathering. So the registered church then slowly, bit by bit, became what I call acceptable to the Vatican. The original bishops were appointed and approved by the government and not by the Vatican. But over the years from the 1970s on, many of them applied to Rome and were appointed formally by the Vatican. And by the time I went to China, most of the bishops of the registered church were appointed by the Vatican. The unregistered church got a special permission from Pope John Paul II to do ordinations, and they then could ordain as they wished. But that was the difference between the two. And sometimes when the registered church, all of the registered church bishops applied to the Vatican for permission to be ordained, but sometimes the permissions did not come through. And because of that, they were considered unacceptable. And a huge tension developed between the registered and the unregistered church. And I remember one old lady, about 80-year-old, who was crying when she spoke to me, when she said that I cannot understand why the unregistered church considers me unfaithful to the Pope. I am faithful to the Pope, my priests are faithful to the Pope, and my bishop is faithful to the Pope. Now, if I can be kind to you as an interviewer, is the government of China interfering? The government of China involves itself in everything in China. For instance, when I go to China, I have to register with the police. All the people of China are registered with the police. When Tony Blair in England tried to bring in an ID card for English people, they objected because they thought it would be an interference on their privacy. But that's not the case in China. The government knows everything in China. Now, is the government interfering? Yes, the government sets regulations for the Catholic Church in China, and it considers many of the meetings of the unregistered church as illegal. So sometimes the local government intervenes, and sometimes a bishop is taken away or a priest is taken away, or the local church is closed down. But the registered church people have no problem. They are celebrating sacraments and mass and all the Catholic liturgy quite safely and without any problem. And also, some people say to me, are the registered people loyal to the Pope? When I went to China first, in all Catholic liturgies throughout the world, there's always a mention of the Pope and the local bishop. So when I went to China first, the Pope's name was not mentioned in the liturgy. But slowly that began to happen. So nowadays, in all the liturgies of the Catholic Church, the Pope's name is mentioned just as it is in London or in Ireland or in Africa. Yes, you see, the image that the Western media has is persecution. I would be inclined to say restricted. Yes, in the 70s and in the 80s and in the 60s, Catholics were persecuted. And I have an extraordinary example of many priests and bishops who were in jail for 10 and 15 and 20 years. that is persecution. They were restricted because of their faith. But nowadays there are new restrictions, there are new regulations limiting the work of the church because the government wants to be in charge of everything. But nowadays there is not the same kind of thing we call persecution in China as there was in the 60s and the 70s. There's restriction. There's restrictions on meetings, there's restrictions on gatherings. But in the registered church, people can get on with their normal responsibilities as Christians. 2 years ago, new regulations came out on the Catholic Church, and some of those now are quite restrictive. When I went to China first in 1979, I was willing to say that you had 10 stories of good news about the Catholic Church in China and 1 story of bad news. Nowadays, I'm inclined to think there's 10 stories of good news, but maybe 3 or 4 stories of bad news because of the restrictions that came in recently. I must say universally yes. Since I went to China, I have received nothing but a welcome, hospitality, and joyful acceptance. Let me give you some examples. If I'm on the street in China with a Chinese map trying to look where will I go, at least 3 or 4 people on the street will come up to me and help me. I don't speak a lot of Chinese and they don't speak a lot of English, but they're willing to help me. The Catholic Church in China has welcomed me, and I have been able to set up training programs for spiritual directors. I've set up teaching programs in dogmatic theology. I've set up training programs in mission theology for the National Catholic Seminary. I am most welcome in these situations. And one of the most extraordinary things I have found in China, everybody in the West is saying China is going modern and going progressive and going into consumerism. Many young people in China today have deep spirituality from their history, from their Chinese history. And in the beginning, I didn't say who I was when I said I was a teacher. But then when I said to them I was a Catholic missionary priest, the conversations I've had with these young university students, not of Catholic faith, but people who are students and intelligent, were quite extraordinary. Very, very deep understanding about spirituality, very deep understanding about values, very deep understandings about divinity. Not maybe my divinity, but about the divinity that they know from the Buddhist, from the Taoist, and from the other religions in China. So I have been extraordinarily welcomed. I have taken people from England to China, bishops and a cardinal, and we met the highest authority in the government, and they welcomed us and gave us an extraordinary welcome. We met the Minister of State for Religion. He gave us a beautiful dinner and had many conversations with us. We went around the country and many people welcomed us as well. So I am simply very happy about the welcome I have received in China as a Catholic missionary priest. Yes, this is a very major question. Pope Francis has now made a negotiation with the Chinese government, and it's a 2-year temporary agreement, and part of it is to unify the church. But what we need to understand is that over the period from 1957, divisions of feelings took place between the unregistered church and the registered church. The unregistered church felt they were loyal to the Pope, and sometimes they accused the registered church of not being loyal to the Pope, that they were loyal to the government. So lots of feelings have developed. So it won't be solved easily, but I can tell you something quite extraordinary. Since Pope Francis made this new agreement with the Vatican about the appointment of bishops, this is after many years of tension between the Vatican and China. And now that Pope Francis and the government have agreed on a procedure which allows the Pope to have the final say on the appointment of bishops, there is a move towards the unification of the Church. And I hope and pray that that will take place. Let me give you some examples. Recently, in the southwest of China, there was a lot of news in the Western press that this bishop, who had belonged to the underground church, would not be able to celebrate on Holy Thursday with the new bishop who was appointed by the Pope. In fact, this bishop said, I accept the Pope, what the Pope is saying. He said, and in fact, he concelebrated with the new bishop, and 50 of his priests from the underground church came and concelebrated with the other priests in that diocese. Slowly, we will have great unity in the church in China, but it will take time because, as you know yourself, feelings can be hurtful and difficult and deep to wipe out. But we're praying for that unity, and that's what Pope Francis is praying for as well. Yes, the Holy Father going to China. You see, there was a marvelous reception by the Chinese emperors for a fellow like Matteo Ricci and for many missionaries. But then the Western world went in and they humiliated China with the Opium Wars, and during the 1800s. They humiliated China in a way that I, as an Irishman, can understand. Because my country is Ireland. We were humiliated by the British for 600, 700, 800 years. The Chinese were humiliated. So I understand their feeling. And sometimes the Catholic Church associated with the Western powers. So there's a tension from the Chinese government against the Catholic Church. In recent years, there was dialogue and there was discussions. During the time of Pope John Paul II, there was dialogue and discussions, and Pope John Paul II wanted dialogue, but there was a lot of tension as well. And during that time, Pope John Paul II excommunicated some bishops who were appointed illegally. So Pope Francis came into a situation of a lot of tension. And now he started off his work in an extraordinary way by an interview. And that interview to a man called S.S.C. had these essential points. The way to approach China is through dialogue and encounter. Dialogue and encounter with an ancient culture and an ancient civilization. You see, many people in the West see China as a state. What Pope Francis told us was, China is more than a state. It's a civilization state with 5,000 years of history, with a huge record of achievement. Think of all the achievements that came through the Chinese people. So now Pope Francis began with this attitude of dialogue and encounter. And then he succeeded in negotiating this deal last September, and that's beginning. Now, there are difficulties with it. Some people oppose it, but most people and most of the people I know in China are in agreement with it. And hopefully before he dies, Pope Francis will actually come to China, because he would be welcomed in an extraordinary way because of his attitude to China. As you probably know, many of the Western countries are afraid of China. Many of the Western countries are saying China is going to take over. Many of the Western countries see China as communist. But Pope Francis has said China is a civilization state and we need to dialogue and encounter with it. And that was the basis for his success. And his hope is that the church in China, between the unregistered and registered church, will be united in the next 15 years or so. I would love if you could come while I'm alive. I'm now 75. My first visit to China was in 1979, which is more than 45 years ago. But I think it won't happen that quickly. The China situation is complex, and the Vatican situation is complex. But I think the Vatican and China understand one another well, because they have rules and procedures through history. So they understand their ways and their methods. So I think Pope Francis would be most welcome. Pope Francis has engaged in dialogue with Mr. Xi Jinping, the President of China, since the day he was made President. He sent him a letter of congratulations on becoming President. There has been numerous communications. And right now in China, there's a display of Vatican art in the Forbidden City, displaying Chinese art. So the levels of communication have increased dramatically between the Vatican and China over the last 2 or 3 years. So hopefully Pope Francis can come and can speak in Tiananmen Square. And that would be a marvelous development if he came. Okay, I have had many, many extraordinary experiences in China. And all of them were really encounters with God through the people I met. To give you an example, one day I went to visit an old priest. He was 80, And he had been in jail for many years. And I said to him, Father, tell me about your story of being in jail. And he said, Father O'Brien, I'm out of jail now. I'm here with these young people, and I'm helping them to know who Jesus Christ is and who God is. And my experience in jail helped me through my prayer to know who God was and who Jesus Christ was. Another example was about Mary New, a young woman belonging to a Catholic family, normal Catholic family in China. And during those bad old days, the churches were closed, they couldn't go to church. Even they were afraid to pray at home in case somebody would see them through the window. They also had to remove the pictures and the statues from their house. And one day her granny took down the picture of the Saint Teresa, the little flower. And Mary said, Granny, you can't remove that picture. She is my favorite saint. And the grandmother said something that is the truth about Catholic faith in China. God will take charge, and God will help us out in everything. Anyway, the bad days went. Mary went and studied engineering. She studied to be a doctor because she thought being a doctor she could help people more. And then her dream as a child about contemplation and a contemplative monastery emerged strongly. She came to England and she studied with the Augustinian sisters in the south of England, went back to China and met her bishop. And her bishop, by an extraordinary chance as well, had been in jail for 20 years. And she said to him, I want to establish a contemplative monastery in your diocese. And he said yes immediately. And I said to the old bishop, why did you say yes so quickly? He said, Father O'Brien, he said, when she said this to me, it reminded me of my time in jail. 10 years in prison, 10 years in solitary confinement. And during those last 10 years, I had nothing to do except to pray. So I understood what she meant by contemplation, talking to God, knowing who God was, knowing who Jesus Christ was. And I consider this an absolute requirement for mission in China today. And then the old bishop smiled and he looked at me because I think he must have seen I got nervous. And he said, Father O'Brien, he said, if you ever want a pair of shoes made, I can make them for you, because I made shoes in the prison as well. And I smiled. But he was only taking away the tension from his extraordinary story of his understanding who God was and who Jesus Christ was. And this monastery would provide a place in his diocese to contemplate God, to contemplate Jesus Christ, and to carry out the mission of Jesus Christ, which is good news and God's love to the people. The sad thing about the story is when we opened the monastery in 2014, the poor old bishop wasn't able to be there because he was ill. But we opened it and it has started. And now it's developing, the sisters are increasing, and they're going to build a nursing home for the aged, because that was the condition on which the monastery was given permission by the government. And hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years they will have a nursing home for the aged. But this was an extraordinary experience of the actions of God through the bishop, through the sister, and a little bit through me, who helped through the prayers and finances from England. I am an Irishman, but I'm living in London, and I've been working on behalf of the Catholic Church in Britain, in England, Scotland and Wales, linking with the Catholic Church in China. But in the newspapers in England, both Catholic and Protestant, and in the secular newspapers, there's always bad news about China. So my website about China puts out the good news about China. And there's a huge amount of good news about China, about the missionary activity of people in China, about the faith of people in China, about the belief of people in China. Many people in the Western press speak about persecution in China, and they see it as something awful, something terrible, something like a dead end. But the truth of the situation is that persecution, take for example here in Rome where we are now, the persecution of the Christians created a situation where they grew in faith and they grew in numbers and they spread all over Europe. I can refer to the 3 or 4 days ago when I celebrated, and I was delighted to see it, St. Charles Luanga and his companions in Uganda. And that death, to the ordinary eye, can appear like the end, that the enemy has won. But not so. That death and the death of his colleagues gave life to Christianity in Uganda. Similarly, in China, the persecution and the oppression to people of faith who maintained steadfast in their faith, that gave life to continue in the children and in the grandchildren. And so many of the children and the grandchildren are seminarians and sisters in the convents today. They heard what their parents have said, and that's deep within them. In my country, in Ireland as well, my grandmother told me how we had to go out to the mountains to Mass, to a Mass rock. And there the priest would say Mass quickly, and if the English soldiers were coming, somebody would spot them on another hill and everybody would disappear. But the faith of people under persecution is not a faith that's ended. It's a faith that's giving life and new life to the good news of Jesus Christ and the good news of God. One of the beautiful things I've known in China is, you see, in universities in China, there is no dealings no teaching of Catholic faith. But every summer, during the vacation, the Catholic dioceses throughout China take all the university students into a summer camp, and they have 2 or 3 or 4 weeks where they help them to grow in faith, grow in doctrine, grow in knowledge, and particularly grow in love of the gospel of Jesus Christ. These young people are doing an extraordinary evangelization within the universities because they're meeting their friends and they're talking about God and talking about Jesus Christ. And these young people impress me deeply. They actually help my faith to grow and help me to believe in God as well.
This program was sponsored by Safe Life Experience Consult Limited. Contact them for all your travel and tour needs, as well as your events.